In this lecture, we are going to start our study of the urinary system. And what we'll be doing in this lecture is going over some of the main functions of the urinary system, and then we're going to go ahead and look at the urinary system organs. So why do we have a urinary system? Well, number one, excrete waste. We know that the urinary system gets rid of all organic waste. In particular, you probably remember urea, and urea came from your protein intake. When we took protein in, those amino acids had to be deaminated, and that amino group got converted into ammonia. The liver will then convert ammonia into the less toxic urea, which will leave through our urine. So a lot of nitrogenous wastes are eliminated by our kidneys. They also control our blood volume and blood pressure. The urine output, the amount of urine that's lost, has a lot of water in it. So you can increase or decrease your urine output, and that will affect your blood volume. We know the blood volume will then affect the blood pressure. So if you were to increase your urine output, that means you urinate more, you pee more. Well, that means that more water is leaving your body. If water is going out, then that would lower your actual blood volume, and then that would lower your blood pressure. You remember that the kidneys released EPO, erythropoietin. That's the hormone that increases your hematocrit. It will trigger the red bone marrow to make more red blood cells. And they also release the enzyme, you can say renin or renin. We also know that they're very, very important for controlling the electrolyte balance in our body. All electrolytes, but the main ones we look at are sodium, potassium, chloride, and calcium, so critical for electrolyte balance. It also is important for acid-base balance. The kidneys are one of the main organs that function for acid-base balance. In fact, the two organs that maintain acid-base balance are the kidneys and the lungs. The kidneys can control the excretion of hydrogen ions and bicarb in the urine. The kidneys can adjust this according to your blood pH. So if you're in an acidosis state, and if you were in acidosis, you would have too many hydrogen ions in your blood. So what your kidneys will do is it will get rid of those in your urine. So you will lose more hydrogens, and then it would actually hold on to the bicarb. And we'll be looking at this later. And then finally, there's this other miscellaneous piece of the kidneys. They really do help detoxify poisons. A lot of medications are eliminated in the urine by the kidney. They do activate vitamin D into its active form so that we can absorb calcium. And with the liver, they do that gluconeogenesis. This is making glucose from a non-carb. So you could make glucose from either glycerol or amino acids. And so the liver does most of it, but they help with it. So when we look at the organs of the urinary system, we have two kidneys. Each kidney is going to filter your blood to generate the urine. The urine then needs a way out of the body. So the rest of the organs are just transporters. So you have two ureters, and their job is to transport the urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. Now, we say bladder all the time, but when we're talking about it on an exam, we have to use its full name, urinary bladder. And then the urinary bladder stores the urine and then body through the urethra. So we have two ureters. They're basically just smooth muscle tubes, and they just transport urine from the kidney. The part of the kidney is actually called the renal pelvis. You'll study that in the next lecture, down to the urinary bladder. The ureters are behind the peritoneal cavity, and they empty into the posterior wall of the bladder. If we were to look at the ureters, there are three layers. The inner layer is epithelial tissue. You might remember transitional from AP1. The middle layer is all the muscle, because the ureters are going to use peristalsis. That's going to be the contraction that a lot of smooth muscle uses to move that urine from the kidney down to the urinary bladder. And then the outer portion has this outside capsule, It's just an outer connective tissue to kind of anchor it to surrounding structures. This is called an IVP. They can inject a dye in and then actually visualize these organs and components. And so you can see the dye, you can see the inside of the kidney. Here's the ureters, and then this is the full urinary bladder, so the two tubes. The urinary bladder is basically a sac that stores urine. So it's hollow, it's muscular, and it's a place where you store urine until you eliminate it. It sits posterior to the pubic symphysis. In females, it's anterior to the uterus. And it's held in place with some of the peritoneum and a lot of ligaments. You don't have to memorize their names, but these ligaments help hold that bladder in place. So if we look at the anatomy for the male, you can see mid-sagittal. We can see the urinary bladder here. Here's the pubic symphysis, and here's the urinary bladder. And if we look at the female, we can see the pubic symphysis, the urinary bladder, and then here's the uterus. So if you're female and you've been pregnant, as that baby grows, that uterus kind of pushes on the urinary bladder, which can cause some incontinence. If we look inside the urinary bladder, there's a couple sphincters we'll be looking at. So they say that when it's empty, it kind of looks like a pear. Use your imagination. But when we look inside of it, we have two sphincters. There's an internal urethral sphincter, and this sphincter is right at what's called the neck of the urinary bladder. It's where it narrows at the bottom. So think about if you were looking at an upside down pear. So it's the sphincter right next to the urethra. So that sphincter opens and closes and controls if urine leaves the urinary bladder to enter the urethra or not. Now it is under control of your parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. It's your parasympathetic that opens the sphincter. Your sympathetic would close the sphincter. So when that sphincter opens, now urine is allowed to leave and enter the urethra. If we look at the lining of the urinary bladder, it is lined with epithelial tissue, more of that transitional stretchy tissue. There is a pretty big muscle here. It's called the detrusor muscle. It's the main muscle of the urinary bladder. It is smooth muscle. That's the muscle that contracts when you urinate. So it contracts to squeeze the urine out. And when it contracts, it also closes off the ureters to make sure urine doesn't flow backwards. In this image, you can see the ureters back here. And so when you urinate, you want the urine to go out. You don't want it to go backwards and up in the ureters. So that muscle is going to contract to help and make sure those get pinched off. How much can your bladder hold? It's numbers all over the place. Generally speaking, 2 cups is a pretty solid number. So, if you're looking at 2 cups, it's about 16 ounces or a pint, depending on what units you would like to use. They say it can actually stretch and hold, I've seen like maybe 3 cups, 3.5 cups. It's a little bigger in males than females. You really don't want to hold your pee though and keep stretching your bladder as much as possible. So normally you will eliminate or avoid urine 4 to 10 times a day, and that just depends on what you're drinking. And when it's empty, it collapses into folds, and the inside of these folds are called the rugae. Once the urinary bladder contracts and that internal sphincter opens, now the urine is going to flow out into the urethra. So when we look at the urethra, it's just a small tube that transports the urine out of the body. In females, it's fairly short, about 1 to 2 inches, and it's anterior to the vagina. If we look at the male urethra, it's much longer, 7 to 8 inches, and it actually has 3 parts to it. So when urine leaves the urinary bladder, there's a gland back here called the prostate gland. And so as it flows through this little piece, which is called actually, let me fix my picture. My lines are a little off. So let me try this again. The prostatic urethra, it's this area right here. I'm circling it. It's kind of shaped like a donut. And so the urethra goes right through it. So this first part that I'm coloring orange goes right through the prostate gland. That's called the prostatic urethra. And then there's another piece of it that goes through basically the pelvic floor muscles. And the smaller piece that goes through those, and I'll draw that here, is the membranous urethra. And it's pretty short. So it's just in the pelvic cavity through the pelvic floor muscles. The largest part of the urethra is the part that goes through the penis. And so that would be this part. And so we call that the penile or spongy urethra. So obviously, if you're going to put a catheter in, it's a different catheter for a male versus a female. The external urethral orifice, that's the fancy name for what I will jokingly call your pee hole, but that's the opening. So if you're going to put a catheter in, you have to find that opening to insert the catheter, and then the catheter goes up the urethra, typically up into the urinary bladder. Now, while the internal sphincter, remember that's up here between the urinary bladder and the urethra, that's the one that's involuntary. The external sphincter is voluntary. That one is made out of skeletal muscle. And that one is further away from the urinary bladder. And we can see it in two places here. So that sphincter you can control, but obviously you have to learn how to control it. We have diapers. Babies can't control it. You have to learn how to process this. It'll be a stretch reflex to be able to relax. But basically, when you got to go and you're holding it, you're squeezing that sphincter so that you don't pee yourself. And then as we, age, and on the other spectrum, we might also lose control over that as well. If we look inside the urethra, just notice again, like everything we've looked at, you've got epithelial tissue. This is stratified squamous. So sometimes some of those cells can be shed in the urine. So urine might have some cells in it, some epithelial cells, but that's just coming off of the urethra. And it also has smooth muscle because it's still going to use peristalsis. So how do we avoid micturition? Basically, as I mentioned, it's a stretch reflex. So the bladder fills with urine and it starts to stretch. When it stretches, it activates the receptors. Those receptors go through afferent fibers. Remember, afferent are going to try to head up to the brain to let you know you got to go. Notice they go through your pelvic nerves to the sacral portion of your spinal cord, up your spinal cord to the thalamus. That was the traffic cop from A&P1. And then it goes to the cerebral cortex. So now you're aware of the urge. You know you got to go. Then the parasympathetic gets activated. That's what's going to contract the urinary bladder and relax that internal sphincter. Now, when you relax that internal sphincter, urine is going to start to leave the bladder and enter the urethra. So now you really know you got to go. And so hopefully you can find a place to go, and then you can relax the external sphincter when you're in an appropriate area. Now, this reflex starts, as you start to fill with urine. So it might start around 200 mLs of urine, 150, 200 mLs. So, you can hold that up to maybe 500, 600, 700 mLs. So the bladder can stretch, but you're going to feel it with around 200. And then it's going to cycle and it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger, which you may have experimented before. As this stretches more and more, those fibers are coming in faster and faster, that information. And then the brain is like, okay, I gotta go. And then you find an appropriate area and you relax the external sphincter. So again, this is all developed over time. This is why you can have kids who might, have incontinence when they sleep. They might be very deep sleepers and the brain never kind of like wakes them up to let them know they have to go. And it can take a while to grow out of this. And that's what incontinence is the inability to control your urine, like voluntarily. So obviously all babies are incontinent until they learn how to process that. And then as we get older, we can have issues. We can also have incontinence from damage to those sphincters or anything in the pathway. You could have someone with Alzheimer's or dementia that can't control their urine and their urine output or those sphincters. Spinal cord nerve damage. All of these could result in some form of incontinence. Stress incontinence is when you have urine in your bladder, so there's some urine there, and then maybe you cough or sneeze or laugh, so that increased pressure makes you void the urine. And as I mentioned, if you've been pregnant, a lot of times that increased pressure from the baby can push on your urinary bladder and also cause you to void a little urine. Whereas urinary retention is inability to void. So typically you will just urinate a small amount. This is common in males with an enlarged prostate gland. The prostate gland is kind of this like donut-shaped gland, and the urethra passes inside of it. So we'll just draw like this circular structure, and then the urethra, we'll just draw it this way, kind of passes through. And so what happens is if that prostate gets enlarged, it can pinch off the urethra. So the bladder's full and the male knows he has to go, but when he goes to urinate, it comes out very slowly, and that's typically from the prostate gland. And we'll talk more about the prostate gland and how to treat it when we look at the reproductive system, what's called BPH, for benign prostate hypertrophy. So this concludes our first lecture on the urinary system.